"You have 72 hours to get out," Rick Patterson's voice echoed through Frank Thompson's small apartment. The landlord stepped closer to the elderly man, his face twisted with impatience and disdain. Frank, 74 years old with silver hair and weathered hands, stood quietly by his kitchen table, holding the eviction notice with steady fingers. Rick Patterson owned 12 rental properties in this part of Denver, and he prided himself on running a tight ship. To him, Frank was just another problem tenant, an old man who paid his rent 3 days late every month, and whose presence somehow diminished the neighborhood's appeal to younger, more profitable renters. But what Rick didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined as he stood there demanding Frank leave, was that this quiet, unassuming man had once saved 15 lives in the jungles of Vietnam. Hidden in Frank's bedroom closet, wrapped carefully in an old military blanket, were 2 medals that told a story of courage Rick Patterson would never understand, a Bronze Star for heroic achievement and a Purple Heart for wounds waged in combat. Frank looked down at the notice again, then back at Rick. "I understand you want me out," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "But I've been a good tenant here for 8 years. I pay my rent, I keep to myself, and I take care of this place." Rick snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. "Good tenant? You're 2 weeks behind on rent, again. And frankly, Frank, you're not exactly the kind of resident this neighborhood is trying to attract anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke. Frank had heard variations of this conversation before, in different places, with different people. The implication was always the same. He didn't believe. At 74, living on a fixed income from his VA disability check and Social Security, Frank had learned to accept that the world saw him as disposable. "I can catch up on the rent," Frank said. "I just need a few more days. My VA check was delayed this month." Rick rolled his eyes. "It's not just about the money, old man. This building is going upscale. I've got young professionals interested in these units, people who can pay market rate without excuses." Frank nodded slowly, understanding the real message. It wasn't about late rent. It was about Rick wanting him gone because he was old, because he drove a beat-up truck instead of a new car, because he didn't fit the image Rick had for his properties. "Where am I supposed to go?" Frank asked, the question hanging between them. Rick shrugged, already moving toward the door. "That's not my problem. You've got 72 hours. After that, I'm filing with the sheriff's office." As the door slammed shut behind Rick, Frank sank into his old recliner, the eviction notice still in his hands. Around him, the small apartment held 40 years of memories. The couch where he'd watched his daughter take her first steps before the divorce took her away. The kitchen table where he'd written letters to veterans organizations, trying to help other guys navigate the system. The bookshelf lined with military history and photographs he rarely looked at anymore. He glanced toward the bedroom, where those medals waited in darkness. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Commendation Medal. They meant something once, back when he thought the country would remember. Now they felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Frank had been 19 when he was drafted in 1968. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, first as a rifleman, then as a squad leader. The Bronze Star came from a night mission near Da Nang, when his unit was pinned down by enemy fire and Frank had crawled through a rice paddy under heavy gunfire to reach a wounded soldier. He'd carried that man, Corporal Jimmy Martinez from Texas, nearly half a mile back to safety. The Purple Heart came 3 months later, when shrapnel from a mortar round tore through his left shoulder and embedded in his ribs. He still carried 2 pieces of that metal in his body, setting off airport scanners and aching when the weather changed. But Rick Patterson didn't know any of that. To Rick, Frank was just an inconvenience, an obstacle to higher profits. Frank stood up slowly, his joints protesting after years of physical labor and old war injuries. He walked to the window and looked out at the street he'd called home for 8 years. Across the way, Miss Chen was tending her small garden. She always waved when she saw him, sometimes brought him soup when she made too much. Down the block, the Ramirez family was loading groceries from their car, the kids laughing as they raced each other to the front door. This was his neighborhood, his community. These were people who knew him, who treated him with the basic dignity that Rick Patterson couldn't understand. Frank's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The caller ID showed a number he recognized. Jerry Hoffman, another Vietnam vet he'd met at the VA hospital. Jerry had become something of an advocate for veteran housing rights after his own struggles with landlords. "Frank? Jerry here? How are you holding up, buddy?" Frank hesitated, then told Jerry about the eviction notice, about Rick's ultimatum, about the 72 hours that now felt like a countdown timer on his life in this place. Jerry listened without interrupting, then spoke with the kind of quiet anger that Frank recognized from their service days. "This is exactly the kind of situation we've been documenting. Landlords who target elderly veterans, assuming they won't fight back." "I don't know if I have any fight left in me," Frank admitted. "Brother, you carried wounded soldiers through enemy territory. You've got more fight in you than any of these people know." After Jerry hung up, Frank sat in his recliner and thought about fighting. He'd done enough of it for one lifetime, hadn't he? In Vietnam, he'd fought for his country, for his fellow soldiers, for principles he believed in. After the war, he'd fought for jobs, for respect, for the right to be seen as more than just a damaged vet. Now at 74, he was supposed to fight for the right to keep a roof over his head. But maybe, Frank thought, looking around the apartment that had become his sanctuary, maybe some fights were worth having. The next morning, Frank was awakened by a knock at his door. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and wondering where he could go with $800 in his checking account and a truck that needed new brakes. When he opened the door, he found a woman in her 30s with a professional appearance and a warm smile. She held a clipboard and wore a badge that identified her as Sarah Mitchell from the Colorado Veterans Legal Aid Society. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Sarah Mitchell. Jerry Hoffman contacted our office about your situation. I'd like to help if you'll let me." Frank stepped aside to let her in, still processing the fact that Jerry had called in reinforcements. Sarah sat at his kitchen table and opened a folder thick with documents. "What Jerry told me about your case fits a pattern we've been seeing across Denver," she explained. "Landlords targeting elderly veterans with harassment and wrongful eviction attempts. It's illegal, and it's exactly the kind of case we exist to fight." Frank poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her. "I don't want to be anybody's charity case." Sarah smiled. "This isn't charity, Thompson. This is about your rights as a tenant and as a veteran. Your landlord can't evict you just because he wants to charge higher rent to someone else. Colorado has strong tenant protection laws, especially for veterans and elderly residents." She pulled out a copy of the eviction notice Rick had given Frank and studied it carefully. "This notice is deficient in several ways. He's claiming non-payment of rent, but according to your lease, you have a 10-day grace period after the first of the month. You're within that period." Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in days: hope. "More importantly," Sarah continued, "I did some research on your landlord. Rick Patterson has filed 19 eviction notices in the past 2 years, almost exclusively against elderly tenants and veterans. That's not coincidence, Mr. Thompson. That's a pattern of discrimination." As Sarah explained Frank's legal options, she asked about his military service. Frank was reluctant at first, but something about her genuine interest made him open up. He told her about Vietnam, about the men he'd served with, about the medals gathering dust in his closet. "Mr. Thompson, do you realize that your service record makes you a protected class under both federal and state law? Discriminating against veterans is a federal crime." Frank had never thought of himself as belonging to a protected class. He'd always just tried to get by, to avoid making waves, to exist quietly in a world that seemed to have moved on from people like him. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Sarah's smile was fierce, the look of someone who'd found exactly the fight she'd been looking for. "I need you to trust me, and I need you to stay right here in this apartment. Don't let Rick Patterson intimidate you into leaving. We're going to show him that veterans don't get pushed around. Not on my watch." That afternoon, as Frank was organizing his bills at the kitchen table, Rick Patterson's truck pulled up outside. Frank watched through the window as Rick climbed out, adjusted his expensive jacket, and strode toward the building with the confidence of a man who believed he owned everything he surveyed. When Rick knocked, Frank was ready. "I told you 72 hours, Rick said the moment Frank opened the door. "I hope you're packed." "Actually, I'm not going anywhere," Frank replied calmly. Rick's face flushed red. "What did you say?" "I said I'm not leaving. I've consulted with a lawyer, and it turns out your eviction notice doesn't meet the legal requirements under Colorado law." For the first time since Frank had known him, Rick Patterson looked uncertain. He shifted on his feet, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked almost like nervousness. "You can't afford a lawyer," Rick said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Frank smiled slightly. "Turns out there are organizations that help veterans with exactly these kinds of problems. Amazing what you learn when you start asking the right questions." Rick's uncertainty quickly morphed back into anger. "Listen, old man, I don't care what some cut-rate legal aid office told you. This is my building, and I want you out." "Then you'll have to follow the proper legal procedures," Frank said, "which, according to my attorney, you haven't done." Rick stepped closer, trying to use his size to intimidate Frank. It was a mistake that revealed how little he understood about the man he was trying to bully. Frank had faced down enemy soldiers in jungle warfare. He'd carried wounded men through hostile territory while bullets flew overhead. He'd survived mortar attacks and earned medals for courage under fire. Rick Patterson's attempt at intimidation was like a gentle breeze compared to the storms Frank had weathered. "You're making a big mistake," Rick hissed. Frank met his gaze steadily. "The only mistake was you thinking I'd just disappear quietly." After Rick left, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of standing his ground. But he knew this was just the beginning. Rick Patterson struck him as the kind of man who didn't accept defeat gracefully. Frank was right. Over the next week, Rick tried several new tactics to make Frank's life miserable. He scheduled unnecessary maintenance visits at inconvenient hours. He posted notices in the building lobby about problem tenants disrupting the community. He even tried to convince other residents that Frank was somehow dangerous. But Frank wasn't the same man who had quietly accepted Rick's ultimatum a week earlier. With Sarah Mitchell's help, he documented every instance of harassment. More importantly, he'd started connecting with his neighbors in ways he hadn't before. Mrs. Chen, it turned out, had her own stories about Rick's attempts to intimidate her into moving. The Ramirez family had received similar pressure to leave, thinly veiled threats about their lease not being renewed. Even some of the younger tenants had grown tired of Rick's heavy-handed management style. Frank began to understand that his fight wasn't just about his own apartment. It was about a community under siege by a landlord who saw tenants as obstacles to profit rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The turning point came on a Thursday morning when Frank was checking his mail in the building's lobby. Rick appeared with two men Frank didn't recognize, both wearing coveralls and carrying toolboxes. "We need to inspect your apartment for code violations," Rick announced. Frank looked at the men, then back at Rick. "Do you have proper notice of this inspection?" "Colorado law requires 24 hours written notice, except in emergencies." Rick's jaw tightened. "This is an emergency inspection." "What's the emergency?" Rick gestured vaguely. "Potential safety hazards." Frank nodded slowly, then pulled out his phone and dialed Sarah Mitchell's number. "Sarah? It's Frank Thompson. My landlord is here with some men claiming they need to do an emergency inspection without proper notice." As Frank spoke to his attorney, he watched Rick's confidence evaporate in real time. The two men with toolboxes exchanged glances and began backing toward the door. "Actually," one of them said to Rick, "we're going to need to reschedule this. We've got another job we forgot about." They were gone before Rick could protest, leaving him alone in the lobby with Frank, who was still on the phone with Sarah. "Mr. Patterson," Sarah's voice came through the phone's speaker, loud enough for Rick to hear. "This is Sarah Mitchell from Colorado Veterans Legal Aid. I need to inform you that your repeated attempts to harass my client constitute violations of both state tenant protection laws and federal veteran discrimination statutes." Rick's face went from red to pale in seconds. Sarah continued, "I'm preparing a formal complaint to be filed with the Colorado Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I suggest you consult with an attorney before making any further contact with Mr. Thompson. After Frank hung up, Rick stood in the lobby for a long moment, the reality of his situation clearly sinking in. He'd picked the wrong fight with the wrong person. "This isn't over," Rick muttered, but the words lacked any real threat. Frank watched him leave, then climbed the stairs to his apartment. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe normally. But the real victory came 3 weeks later, when Frank received a registered letter from Rick Patterson's attorney. The eviction notice was being withdrawn. More than that, Rick was offering to extend Frank's lease for 2 years at his current rent, with a formal apology for any misunderstandings. Frank called Sarah Mitchell to share the news. "Congratulations, Mr. Thompson. But this is bigger than just your case. We've had 6 other tenants from your building contact us about similar harassment. Rick Patterson is going to find himself facing a much larger legal problem very soon." That evening, Frank sat in his recliner and thought about the past month. He'd gone from facing homelessness to securing his housing for the next 2 years. But more than that, he'd rediscovered something he thought he'd lost somewhere between Vietnam and old age: the knowledge that he was worth fighting for. He got up and walked to his bedroom closet, reaching into the dark space where his medals had waited in silence for so many years. The bronze star felt heavier than he remembered, its metal surface reflecting the light from his bedside lamp. Frank had earned this medal by refusing to leave a wounded soldier behind, by carrying a man to safety when it would have been easier and safer to retreat. 50 years later, he'd learned that the same courage still lived inside him. He just needed to be reminded that some things, some people, some principles were worth the fight. The next morning, Frank did something he hadn't done in decades. He pinned the bronze star to his jacket and walked to the corner store where he bought groceries every week. The clerk, a young man named David, who had always been polite but distant, noticed the medal immediately. "Is that real?" David asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Frank nodded. "Vietnam, 1969. My grandfather served in Vietnam," David said. He never talked about it much, but he had one of those medals too. Said it was the most important thing he ever did. As Frank walked home with his groceries, he thought about David's grandfather, about all the veterans who had carried their stories in silence, who had convinced themselves that their service didn't matter to a world that seemed to have moved on without them. Frank had spent 50 years believing that narrative, accepting that his medals were just pieces of metal, that his service was ancient history. But Rick Patterson's attempt to push him out of his home had taught him something important. His worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions or society's indifference. It was determined by his actions, by his willingness to stand up for what was right, by his refusal to disappear quietly into the shadows. 6 months later, Frank received a letter that would have been impossible to imagine during those dark days when he faced eviction. The Colorado Veterans Legal Aid Society was offering him a part-time position as a tenant rights advocate, helping other veterans navigate housing discrimination and legal challenges. Frank accepted immediately. His first case involved an 80-year-old Korean War veteran in Colorado Springs, whose landlord was trying to force him out of rent-controlled housing. The tactics were familiar: harassment, improper notices, attempts to intimidate an elderly man into giving up his right. Frank drove the 3 hours to Colorado Springs in his old truck, his bronze star pinned to his jacket and a folder full of legal documents in his passenger seat. As he sat across from the veteran in his small apartment, listening to a story that echoed his own experience, Frank realized that Rick Patterson had inadvertently given him the greatest gift of his later years: the knowledge that his fight wasn't over, that his service continued, that there were still battles worth winning. "The thing about bullies," Frank told the Korean War veteran, "is that they count on you believing you're powerless. But here's what I learned: we're never powerless as long as we're willing to stand our ground." Frank Thompson had discovered that courage wasn't something you used up in war and then lived without. It was something that grew stronger every time you chose to use it, every time you refused to let someone else define your worth, every time you remembered that dignity wasn't something anyone could take away from you. Some fights, Frank had learned, are worth having, and some victories taste sweetest when they come to those who thought their fighting days were behind them. The apartment Frank had nearly lost became the launching pad for a new chapter of service. one where his medals weren't gathering dust in a closet, but serving as reminders that the values he'd fought for in Vietnam, courage, loyalty, and refusal to abandon those who couldn't fight for themselves, were just as relevant in a Denver apartment building as they had been in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Rick Patterson eventually sold his rental properties and left the real estate business entirely, but not before facing significant legal consequences for his pattern of veteran discrimination. The community Frank had nearly been forced to leave became stronger, more unified, more willing to stand up for its most vulnerable members. And Frank Thompson, 74 years old and still fighting the good fight, finally understood that some service never ends. It just changes uniform.